Hello, welcome to my research video. My name is Sydney Mullins and I'm an intern at the University of Kentucky Special Collections Research Center Learning Lab internship. I'm basically an archival assistant. Today I would like to talk about fonts. For those of you who don't know, I intended to disseminate this research at the National Conference for Undergraduate Research, but that didn't end up happening because of serendipity. Some undergrads who didn't get to go this year because of the virus that will not be named decided to continue their research and to share it at next year's conference. But those of us who are not going to be undergrads next year, me included, had to come up with some creative way to share our research. And believe you me, I'm out of my comfort zone. There's a learning curve. Long story short, I'm going to share my research project with you in video format, rather than an academic paper or something. I hope you're excited about 20th century Kentucky fonts, because I sure am. My research this year with the Special Collections Research Center has revolved around rare books printed in the 20th century in Kentucky. I cataloged over 100 handmade books from Kentucky, and I identified every single one of their fonts. Every one. And I'm here to tell you how it breaks down. There are an estimated 200,000 fonts in existence. You have your Times New Romans and your Comic Sans and your Arial bolds and your wingdings. The three main types of fonts are serif fonts, which have the little feet at the bottom, sans serif fonts, which don't have the little feet, and scripts, which look like cursive or handwriting. These categories can be subdivided into font families, of which there are thousands. The Caslin family, for instance, contains hundreds of different variations of fonts, all of which are very hard to distinguish from each other because they're all so similar. While I was working with the Burr Press collection in the Special Collections Research Center, I noticed that this particular press always printed their books in a font called Goudy Old Style. And I thought, why? Was it just easier to read? Was it pretty to look at? So I started investigating other books printed around the same time and in the same area and at similar presses, just because I wanted to know what font they were using and why. The answer isn't shocking, but it's interesting and it's multifaceted and it's complex. In this video, I'll explain my methodology for identifying fonts. I'll explain my findings after cataloging 100 handmade books, and I hope to answer the question, why these fonts? It will help to begin with a little background in the area of printing presses. The private press tradition has been very strong in central Kentucky ever since the state's first newspaper, the Kentucky Gazette, was published when Kentucky was still part of Virginia. Being so rural, the Appalachian area was in need of news and books, and a demand for printing presses cropped up. Today, there are still a handful of private presses in operation. They're distinguished from fine art presses or industrial presses by their hobbyist nature. Modern private presses are typically maintained by artists or craftsmen who have another day job. In Kentucky, there are several. Here's a short list of the ones I researched for this project. I've been able to access over 100 rare books printed by these presses through the UK Library's Special Collections Research Center. The Research Center is an on-campus archive that houses hundreds of thousands of historic documents and archival collections. The center's rare book collection alone is home to over 9,000 rare volumes in all shapes, sizes, bindings, and subjects. The books can be reserved for research purposes in the Breckenridge Research Room, but they can't be taken out. They must be handled with extreme care. No food or ink pens can be brought around them, and they have to sit gently in foam wedges to relieve the stress from their bindings. The bulk of my research time went towards identifying typefaces. As you can imagine, this is quite time-consuming, and it involves a steep learning curve for novices in the field, which I was about 4 months ago. My methodology for identifying fonts can best be described by this flowchart. It's a simple matter of, if I can't identify the font, what should I try next? I generally start by requesting books online through the Special Collections Research Center portal. My request is processed within 2 to 3 days, and then I go to the Breckenridge Research Room to physically work with the books. I typically reserve 20 to 50 books at once, and in a week I can process around 20 or 30 of them. Once I've made it to the research room and I have a book picked out, I follow my flowchart. First, I check the colophon. The colophon is on the very last page of most hand-printed books. It typically includes the author's name, the press who printed it, and the geographic location of that press. Often it will also list the type of paper that the book was printed on, and if you're lucky, it will include the typeface. That's why I always check the colophon first. If the typeface isn't listed in the colophon, as certain presses often omit it, I then try to identify the font on my own. I compare it to known specimens, since some typefaces have certain tells. Compare the T in Caslin to the T's in Gaudi Old Style and Electra. Gaudi and Caslin have splayed serifs at the top of the T, but Electra's serifs point straight down. I look for these little hints with the help of an encyclopedia of 20th century metal typefaces, and if I can't match the typeface to any known specimen found in the encyclopedia or my other materials, I then go to Font Squirrel. The website Font Squirrel is home to an app called the Font Identifier. This app does exactly what it sounds like. You upload a scan of the typeface, preferably a single sentence between 40 and 80 characters. The font identifier then scans each character, and it spits out 12 or 15 results of what font it might be. The top 3 results are usually the best bet. The app comes with the feature to manually adjust your text, so you can be sure it's identifying each character correctly. I look up the specimens of my web results in my encyclopedia, and I compare them to the typeface of the original book. I hope to find a match, obviously. This website is a great way to bring technology into the research. The computer might notice nuances that my eyes just can't, and it certainly has a bigger database than I do. If a better app made for this purpose exists, I don't know of it. I use this tool last because it is the most time-consuming, so if I can identify a font using another method first, I'll try to do that before I use Font Squirrel. Unfortunately, Font Squirrel isn't successful every time. If I can't identify a typeface using this method, I'll shelve the book and look at it another day. It often happens that I shelve a book and then I find a match for its typeface in the colophon of a completely separate book. In that case, I'll pull both books for comparison. I would say that around 5% of the books I've worked with have had to be shelved, meaning that this methodology works for roughly 95% of the private press books that I've pulled. A large part of the methodology's success is that some presses are just very good about reporting which typeface they use in the colophon, such as the Polyglot Press or the Buttonwood Press, which are both Lexington presses. After reviewing over 100 of these rare books, here are the numbers. Fonts, as you can imagine, are hard to definitively confirm, but easy to prove wrong, so please keep some margin of error in mind for these numbers. It seems like the other category took the cake, but the fonts in this other category appeared only once or twice in my research, and they were what I would consider to be obscure fonts. Each one constitutes only 1 or 2% of the whole body of typefaces represented here. Besides the other category, American Uncial and Caslin were the most popular fonts, tied for first. American Uncial is a font designed by notable Austrian printer and designer Victor Hammer, the font itself being based on the text found in the Book of Kells, a medieval manuscript of the New Testament Gospels. It was used predominantly by the presses that Victor Hammer helped found, such as the King Library Press, because Hammer found it easier to start with a typeface he already had several sets of. The books printed in American Uncial are more likely to be religious texts, such as the Four Gospels or prayers written by Thomas Merton, a Kentuckian monk and theologian. I've seen this font in my everyday life since conducting my research. It's most notably used as the font on Mellow Mushroom's promotional material. In Arthur Graham's 1980 volume Monograph for Typophiles, Graham states that the typeface is evocative of the East, which would explain its choice for religious texts, and also for a self-proclaimed bohemian pizza chain. Caslin is the uncomplicated serif font that I mentioned earlier. It looks similar to Times New Roman, but Arthur Graham's Monograph has the opinion that this English font looks Spanish and evokes a Don Quixote aesthetic. It's used for every type of book, from poetry anthologies to historic vignettes to joke books. Less popular, but still widely used, are the fonts Garamond, Emerson, and Joanna. These typefaces are also uncomplicated serif fonts, and Arthur Graham has no opinions about them. They're almost interchangeable aesthetically, and are used mostly for short stories and poetry anthologies. If there is a correlation between these typefaces and such short-form works of fiction, I have yet to do any research into it. If I had to venture a guess, though, I would say these typefaces were chosen because they are neither offensive nor distracting, just a little boring. Gaudi Old Style, the preferred font of the Burr Press, is used mostly for poetry as well. Arthur Graham comments that this font is suitable for English poetry, but evokes an aesthetic of classical antiquity, like the Aeneid or the works of Homer. It's one of my personal favorites because of how round its letters are and the diamond-shaped punctuation that it uses, which adds a beautiful and delicate detail. I use this font instead of Times New Roman whenever I have the excuse to. Palatino is another serif font that is aesthetically similar to Joanna. It's typically used for poetry or to label artwork, and it's easy to spot thanks to its flat serifs rather than curved ones like we see on Emerson. So why these fonts? That's the question I sought to answer in the first place. To be honest, when I set out to do this research, I really wasn't expecting to find a lowercase medieval demi-serif to be the most popular typeface. I was expecting to find a bunch of boring serif fonts, because I thought that typeface choice was based on utility. The popularity of American Uncial, however, may speak against that idea. Just look at these two sentences. Which one do you think is easier to read? Gaudi Old Style, right? But which one is more interesting, more exotic, more mysterious? It seems like utility wasn't the only motivating factor for these Kentucky printmakers. The other factor that I found interesting in my research has been the frequency of different printing presses authoring the books in the research pool. Here are the proportions of my research books organized by which presses produced them. Larkspur Press is a well-known press, and it's prolific in Kentucky even today, while the Anvil Press hasn't produced a book in years. Other presses, including the Polyglot Press, the Buttonwood Press, and the Stamperia del Santuccio, were producing books mostly between the 1960s and 80s, even if they still are producing books today. The King Library Press is the residential printing press of the University of Kentucky, so it continues to produce all kinds of printed material, from books to calendars to postcards, thanks to the work of volunteers and thanks to subsidies that the University of Kentucky gives it to keep it running. The King Library Press even hosts printing workshops occasionally, and it's always accepting volunteers. If you live in the Lexington area and you're interested in printing or typesetting, you should really check them out. The production of the different presses doesn't seem too significant until we place them on a map. All of the presses I saw in my research had a home in one of these places. If you know your Kentucky geography, you'll recognize that these presses seem to be clustered around north-central Kentucky, where we have the most urban areas. To the east, we have the Appalachian Mountain Range, or, in other words, coal country. To the west, the land slowly flattens out, becoming less Appalachian and more Midwestern, with no large urban areas west of Bowling Green, or Louisville, depending on who you ask. The point is, even if Trappist and Monterey aren't terribly urban compared to the other locations, they're still within an hour's drive of a city. This is significant because we don't think of printing presses as being endemic to urban areas. We don't think of books as being endemic to urban areas either. Perhaps it's not books or presses that are unique to these urban areas, but rather fine art. After all, if I wanted to pick up a Penguin Classic at Walmart, I could do that in Hopkinsville. I wouldn't have to go all the way to Lexington for it. If I want a hand-printed Gospel of Mark written in original Latin and hand-bound in kidskin leather, however, I might have to go to Lexington to get that. This is not to say that rural places don't have access to fine art, but rather that very high entry-level forms of fine art, say bookmaking, where you have several sets of typeset in a large, expensive printing press, require a certain level of proximity to a commercial center. You need to acquire your materials there, perhaps take classes there, meet and talk with other fine artists there, and you have to find a market for your artwork there. All of this just demands a large population to warrant the creation of fine art. As you move away from urban centers, your interactions with them become less frequent and less strong. In human geography, the term distance decay describes a phenomenon where cultural interactions between two locations become more and more strained as the two locations move away from one another. In application, this could explain why we see more private presses and fine art presses in Lexington than we do anywhere else. These presses are closer to an urban and cultural center than other locations. The effort that it takes for you to get into town is proportional to your distance from town. For example, it's easier to get to Lexington from Versailles than it is from Hopkinsville. This creates a spectrum of how likely different distances from an urban center are to interact with that urban center. This is why you find so many private presses in Lexington but none in Hopkinsville. This is all in the name of trying to figure out why some fonts are preferred above others. The fact that almost 3/4 of all these books were printed in cities helps point us towards another reason: urban abundance. I find that the King Library Press uses a large variety of fonts, more than any other press. Located in the heart of the University of Kentucky, which is in turn nestled in the heart of Lexington, the King Library Press simply had more access to Lexington's market of typeface selection. The King Library Press was using fonts I had never heard of. They used scripts and Jessen shrifts and uncials. Every book had its own font. They were all different. As you radiate out of Lexington, however, the variety becomes slimmer and slimmer. Larkspur Press alternates between Joanna, Palatino, and Caslin, with a little Emerson thrown in now and then. These fonts are all very similar looking and accomplish the same smart, clean look. Why does the University Press get to play with all the fun fonts while Larkspur is stuck with a bunch of boring ones? They were in a city, and they had access to them. My earlier hypothesis that fonts were chosen exclusively out of utility holds up, but only for the more rural places, not for the urban ones. The farther you get from urban centers, the harder it is to find a demand for a variety of typefaces. It's not that Larkspur Press can't order a set of wacky script fonts, because they can. It's a matter of, are we going to use this typeset often enough to justify buying it? If the answer is no, we don't get that many book commissions as it is, maybe you don't get to buy the wacky script typeface. Maybe they just stick to non-offensive and non-distracting fonts. Is that it then? Presses just use fonts when they can justify it monetarily? Yes and no. I had the outlier now and then, where a relatively rural press used a FunScript font with curly Q serifs on it. That just wasn't the case for most of my research. This research video really just covers the bare bones, to be honest. I have more data than I know what to do with, and this is just the best I could interpret it. Working with the Special Collections Research Center has been more than a learning experience. It's been a great privilege to be able to create knowledge in my field. Over the course of my research with the SCRC, I've learned about so much more than just typefaces and printing. I've learned about archives and primary research and Appalachia and art and craft, and a little about myself. If this pandemic hadn't hit when it did, I may have been able to spread my research to all kinds of people, so this is just the next best thing. If you take anything away from my research, please keep in mind that no one knows the breadth of knowledge there is in a certain topic. There's probably so much more research left to be done about 20th century Kentucky typefaces. So much statistical analysis, just somebody needs to get in there and do it. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. It means a lot more than you could know to so many people. Bye for now.